thank you to Dr. Schulmeister for agreeing to be our last speaker and to give a talk that scientists and non-scientists can understand. So I'm not going to spend any time of Dr. Schulmeister's time doing more than just introducing her as Associate Professor of Earth Sciences. So thank you, Marcia. And she will give her remarks, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. We usually try to get out of here at 5 o'clock. So
you're going to cut me off?
Well, yeah, I've got the gong back there.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think we're going to need to turn the lights
Yes,
off.
we will turn the lights off.
I'm glad you guys are all here. I've been wanting to do this talk since I've returned. And, you know, put things off until somebody like Ellen comes along and provides a milestone or a deadline. So I've just pulled this together. If I were giving this talk in Thailand, we'd be in a room right now with a portrait of the king and a portrait of the queen and a Thai flag. So I thought I'd put them on piece. King Rama IX is the longest reigning king ever in history. He's been king for 66 years.
Wow.
Longer than the Queen of England, longer than any other reigning monarch. And he's 86 years old this year. So they celebrate his birthday every year. This year, I was there when they were celebrating his birthday. Building-sized portraits, teletrons, is that what they're called? The big TV screens all over Bangkok outdoors with pictures of the king, movies of the king. It's a big deal. And also, I was going to mention that most presentations done through any sort of state or federal agency, you'll recognize a speaker by their jacket. So I don't know if you noticed when you walked in, but I'm wearing kind of a heavy dark black jacket for spring, although it's not really spring, with the Thai logo and my agency name on the back. And it's very customary if you work for any state or federal agency to have something like this that you wear all the time. In fact, students in the colleges all have uniforms. In the colleges you have polo shirts with your logos on them. In the grade schools you wear uniforms. And so they joke about how you never really outgrow your uniform. You go to work, the workers always wear pink. So I thought I would, hey, Daryl's here. And I would try to live the part today. So I would like to wish you a Happy New Year. Suk San Songkran, which means Happy New Year in Thai. Just a few days ago, the country celebrated this important holiday. It's the very end of their dry season, and we'll talk about the seasons here in a few minutes. And it culminates with a three-day long water fight. It started thousands of years ago, several thousand years ago, with water that was used to wash the Buddha. And the water was considered holy, and it was a blessing to spray or pour it on top of someone. Today, Songkran is a tourist event. It's a sort of considered the new year, basically. And it's a time when everyone who lives in or works in the city goes home to the countryside to see their families. These are some examples of what happens in that three-day water fight. In fact, so much water is used. It used to be customary to use buckets. Today, high-powered squirt guns are the norm. Ice water down your back when you're sitting at a coffee shop. It's a wild and crazy money-making tourist event for some of the bigger cities. I read that they use so much water that you could fill 4,500 tanker cars a length of about 6 miles on the highway with that water. So they use a lot of water. Water is a real important entity to the Thai. They've kind of got a love-hate relationship, as we're going to talk about here. The love-hate relationship really originates based on the climate. So you geographers and social scientists probably understand this climatic system a little bit better than I do. But this weather there is dominated by a monsoon season. And I understand that the monsoon in Southeast Asia is the most dramatic in the world. Rainy season from May to November, and a dry season from November to April. So the dry season culminates in the Songkran holiday. Usually it's typically rainy, cloudy, warm, southwest monsoon from May to September. And then the drier, cooler northwest monsoon from November to March. So most of you know what happens with the monsoon, right? Intense rainfall. And that intense rainfall is something that's very difficult to manage. What happens during the dry season? very dry conditions, right? And so the love-hate relationship stems from trying to manage both ends of that water spectrum. This is Bangkok. That's a picture taken out of my hotel room window at the top. That's a picture taken on the streets of Bangkok at night. So the economy of Bangkok is one of the strongest in the world. There are about 9 million people who live in the city. And the industry is a lot like what you find in New York, Hong Kong, Beijing. The city also maintains incredible historical features. This is 15th century. The second capital of Thailand was actually established in Bangkok, and anyone who's had a chance to go to Bangkok knows that there are beautiful temples, incredible artifacts, a lot of history. The nightlife, the vendors on the street, totally different world. You walk wall to wall, you can't get through. The rows of clothing and aisles of merchandise. A different economy, but yet a strong one. The vendors, I read something about one vendor who had made more money running 4 street booths than he did with a master's degree as a public servant working for the government. So this is an important commodity as well. If you ever shop in the markets at night or even in the daytime in Bangkok, you know that things are very inexpensive there. But they move a lot of material, a lot of merchandise. So Bangkok has got a lot of different aspects, a lot of different elements. And one of the important features, as we talk about the water system, is the Chao Phraya River. Chao Phraya River flows through central Bangkok. It's a major thoroughfare for transportation. This is a water taxi. You can get around the larger, around the commercial parts of Bangkok by water taxi. There's also tourist industry. I'm on a boat here. Those can be rented, and they're called longboats, just for tourists. The major rivers oftentimes will take you to some of the oldest temples. And probably one of the most important aspects of the Chao Phraya is this docking area. Another picture taken from the hotel room window, so it's not real clear. But out here is the ocean, and this is a port with tanker ships and loading and unloading docks. So that Bay of Thailand, I'll show you where it is here on the map. Yes, right there. We're in Bangkok here. Receives a lot of the commercial merchandise. And so that part of Bangkok is pretty important to the economy as well. Bangkok is also accessed by what are called klongs or canals. The entire city is only 1.5 meters above sea level. So it's built on a delta that extends out into the Gulf of Thailand. And these klongs are interconnected once again as part of a transit system, a waterway. Here's the Chao Phraya, the River of Kings, and these are the klongs that connect with it. Who lives along the klongs? Many thousands of mostly low-income Thai residents. There's a lot of poverty along the klongs, and a lot of these homes really are prepared for the major floods that occur almost every year in Bangkok. So some of you may remember a couple of years ago, 2011, hearing about the floods in Bangkok. Pretty substantial flooding. This is King Rama 4 Highway, which I actually spent some time on when I was there. The entire, that's an entrance ramp to an overpass, but major highway, completely underwater. Here are a few commuters coming home from work. I like this picture because the girls are all holding their really expensive shoes as they walk through the water waist deep, so they don't have to at least damage their shoes. 13.6 million people affected, not just in Bangkok, but upstream in the Chao Phraya River Valley. 65% or 65 of Thai's 77 provinces, like our states, were declared flood disasters. So again, the flooding extended beyond just the city of Bangkok, but upstream into some of the central parts of the country. So consequently, some of that upland farm area, about 7,700 square miles of farmland, were damaged as part of the floods. So the flooding was a really devastating situation in 2011. I read that it was classified by the World Bank as the world's 4th most costly disaster in history. $45.7 billion US in damages and losses. And I also read, and I think this was in the World Bank as well, that it was the worst ever in terms of the amount of water and the people affected. There's a picture, if you can see it in the lighting, of a monk in a little raft, and he's being carefully escorted by probably just one of the locals. The monks are highly revered, and they're very well taken care of. And I'd hate to be that guy. A lot of residential properties, especially along the Klongs, were impacted. So the flooding is one aspect then of water management in Thailand that I think is pretty interesting. We have flooding here in the US as well. In some instances, we're better prepared for it. In other cases, we're not. This is a bank note. This is a 1,000 baht note, dollar, I guess. And the front of all of them had the same image of the king. When you go into your wallet, they all look the same. Here's the 10, the 100, the 1,000, the 500. But if you flip it over on the back, sometimes they've got some pretty interesting information. Here's King Rama IX, and you'll see he's standing here next to one of the many dams that was constructed for both flood control and to provide electricity. He's known, this king who's been in office, I guess, for 66 years, has a reputation, or has is known for some of his royal water projects, specifically his irrigation and his flood control projects. The country's actually very advanced with regard to sustainable living. There's something else here that I didn't see until I read a little bit online about sustainable gardening. So it's also featured on the back of the thing. So King Rama worked with provincial districts to try to curtail a little bit of the flooding that occurs down here in Bangkok. This is the Chao Phraya River Basin. It's about 35 square kilometers, 35,000, sorry about that. And the Chao Phraya in red is really fed by 3 main tributaries, the Ping, the Yang, and the Nam rivers, which receive a lot of rainfall in the highlands, the upland areas. This is kind of like a great big basin, depression. The Chao Phraya Basin is surrounded by upland mountain ranges. So all of them drain kind of into the center part of the basin, eventually into the Gulf of Thailand. King Rama IX was responsible initially for damming up some of the highlands, providing more water for the farmers that were up in the uplands, and he actually really changed the economy of those regions. A lot of poverty was eliminated in the upland regions when the farmers had access to greater water resources. And later on, he worked on some of these larger hydroelectric and flood control dams. So again, a lot of government oversight, and most of this was directed by the king. If you look online at the Thai newspapers, this one's called the Thai Mail, if you look at Bangkok Post right now, you'll see the headlines just like this one. So we just had a major flood, and just recently, in fact, during the last dry season, the droughts were some of the worst in history. So who's impacted by those droughts? Largely the farmers in the upland areas. So the dams aren't really getting a lot of business these days. The waters in some of the rivers and streams have gone completely dry. The last I looked online, it was late March, 45 provinces have been declared disaster areas because of drought. So 2 years ago, they were in disaster mode because of flooding, and today they're in disaster mode because of the drought. This last statement was in reference to the Songkran, because you'd think when half of the country is declared disaster in drought, it would not be such a good time to have a 3-day water fight. But the government and most of the tourist industry decided that that was such an important income for the community. And it was such an important historical holiday, an event for folks who go home to reunite with their families, that they would let the Songkran continue. So while there's this sort of scenery in the north, there are bikini-clad tourists throwing water balloons at each other in the south, right? So again, why are the droughts occurring in Thailand? Largely because of the El Nino phenomenon, the monsoon season. It's pretty well established historically that this part of the country has extreme dry and extreme wet periods. Okay, so that's a little bit about the hydrologic system, the wet and the dry. Let's talk for a minute about those farmers who have to manage this process. The people who live in the Chao Phraya River Basin, for example. Annual crop production in Thailand is pretty interesting. Many times you'll have 3 growing seasons, 2 to 3 crops planted on the same fields, 2 to 3 harvests per year on those fields. The Chao Phraya produces some of the, I believe it's the highest rice producing area in the world. Or I know Thailand is the highest rice producing area in the country. And I think Chao Phraya leads #1 in terms of rice. So what's really impacted during the drought and the flooding events is the rice fields, the paddy fields they call them. If you look at this closely, you'll see rice, sugarcane. Sugarcane is another dominant crop that's planted sometimes continuously all year long. Usually a cane field can sustain for about 3 years before you actually pull the plants. Otherwise they're harvested once a year and the roots are left in. Dry season crops, sugarcane, rice, some fruits, something called morning glory. I know it as a flower here, but they use it as a vegetable there. Some papaya, mango, coconut, lots of fruits. Different things are planted in the upland area. The upland crops are a little different than what's down in the basin. But if you look at the rainy season, same thing. It's about the same types of crops that are planted. The dominant crops are always rice and sugarcane. And both of those require massive amounts of water. So the water is a really important limiting factor for production of crops in the basin areas and for the economy in the Chao Phraya Basin. While I was in Thailand, I got the chance to meet with a provincial irrigation district. And it was just sort of by accident that they presented to me a movie on their royal irrigation system. This was the opening slide for that movie. There's the king and the queen. This is the city hall. They're very proud of their king and queen, and that little fence that goes around the city hall building. What these guys did in the 1970s was they recognized the problems with the drought, and they were actually provided funding through the royal king's irrigation system to go out and establish well fields and start to access not the river water, but the groundwater. Sukhothai is the name of the province. This is, if you could read Thai, you'd see that that's Sukhothai province. And Sukhothai is located right here centrally, located with respect to the Chao Phraya River Basin. So it extends up like this. The Sukhothai area is known, it's very famous, because it was the very first capital of Thailand. So I had to throw a couple of cultural fun slides in. These guys are about 5,000 years old. Very first temples, there's a Buddha that's kind of worn out, and then elephants protecting one of the main temples in Sukhothai. The Sukhothai stands for the dawn of heaven, and so it's a pretty important place culturally. And so geographers might know World Heritage Sites. It's considered a World Heritage Site. It's a pretty unique place. What the province was able to do, the irrigation system, Royal Irrigation District in the province, was to go along the Chao Phraya River and to identify areas that were really important for farming. So this whole region was considered important farm area. Where's the scale on this map? I don't know if that says kilometers. I presume it does, but I think that's about 20 kilometers across. You GIS guys, notice there's a north arrow, even in Thailand, and a scale. So if you look at this long enough, you'll notice some funny looking patterns. They don't have township and range and section like we do, but this is these brown lines. Those brown lines are piping or irrigation pipe that connect up 144 groundwater wells that were put in by the Royal Irrigation District. Again, the idea was to extract the water from the ground because it was more reliable than worrying about flooding and droughting and the limited amount that might exist in the Chao River. So these wells were installed. They weren't just installed like we might install a well on campus for you guys who are in my classes. These were installed deeper with a lot more production behind them. Those wells connect with irrigation systems that take the water to every farmer, every stakeholder in the area that might need to use it. So a typical irrigation well might extend down to about 400 feet. This is probably meters. It's more than 150 meters, I think. And I'm not going to go into the details, but just to indicate that the wells go down through a layer of clay into a layer of sand and gravel where they produce from. And they were intended then to be connected, these are all well houses, by a series of either lagoons or irrigation pipes. They started with lagoons. I think now most of them are irrigation pipes, or canals would be a better word, I guess. What's pretty interesting about these is that they were built then to be sort of community water supplies. Here in Kansas, for example, a farmer might put a well in and supply his ranch. In Thailand, the government puts a well in and they supply maybe 5 or 6 ranches for farmers. And the government not only builds the well house, but also the living quarters for the pump operator. And so if you're lucky enough to run one of these wells, you live in a really nice house. They're always, of course, it's Thailand, so the flora is beautiful. And there are lots of flowers usually year round. Inside the pump house is a high capacity pump, draws that water up out of the ground, and then it pumps it out the backside of the well house, and then it's either drained through irrigation canals or through piping, and it's used to flood the rice paddy fields. So it's mostly flood irrigation for you guys who know a little bit about irrigation. And you can see this field, this is planted in rice that has been harvested recently, just pours out, and this particular farmer is growing rice, and so it floods the rice fields and provides a constant supply of water. The yields, 40 million cubic meters per year in some of those wells. Okay, so it's a little different style of management than we're used to. It's run by the government. Now the problem, we're getting to the part where I step in. The problem with the wells that have been installed since 1976 is that they've overpumped the aquifer. And you've probably heard about overpumping in the Ogallala here in Kansas, or in the North China Plain if you've been to my talks on China, where the water table was depleted about 50 meters since the 1960s. What's happened is that the shallow groundwater has been heavily pumped, and continuous pumping has led to a rate of about 1/10 to 1/20 of a meter per year. Farmers have had to lower the pumps in their wells. The pump's right here. The water table is depleted. The whole thing has to be moved, and it's very expensive to do that. I should say that Royal Irrigation District has had to do that with the farmers. So it costs the taxpayers money to do that, of course. And it's damaging the aquifer system. Okay, so it was a good idea maybe to go for groundwater, but we're starting to use up the groundwater as well. So about 5 years ago, the Thai Ministry of the Environment, Division of Groundwater Resources, my jacket, established a program to try to resupply the groundwater. And their idea was to take water during the flood stage out of the river and recharge it or inject it back into the ground. This is the banner that stood behind me at our opening ceremony presentation. And if you were able to translate that to English, it would say this: feasibility study on drought and flood relief by aquifer storage and recovery in the upper part of the Chao Phraya River Basin. Okay, so the talk I wanted to give today, the technical part of it, is all about this, aquifer storage and recovery. I'm going to explain to you a little bit today about what that is and about our role, the American, our role in this project. You'll see Emporia State's appropriate logo. I got the right one up there. Working in conjunction with an environmental company called SNT. And it's interesting the way that environmental projects are managed in Thailand. Usually any company that works with the Thai government has a publications group that works with them, or a PR group, basically. So ANGSA planned all of our meetings with stakeholders. Anytime I gave a presentation, they were there to fix my slides up, or they were there to run the projector, make handouts, publicize it to the community. We don't do that here very often. Usually we let someone in-house take care of that. And the other members of the team, Kevin and Lindsay, are engineers with CH2M Hill, a company out of Denver. So we're a pretty interesting team. This is the group during one of our presentations at the Thai Ministry of the Environment, Division of Groundwater Resources in Bangkok. And you'll see, I'm the only one who's really not dressed up. There's Kevin and Lindsay, the engineers. I'm the geochemist, and we're the American team. They brought us in because we thought we might have a little bit more information, a little bit more experience with these systems than they did. An ASR system has never been used in Thailand before. Sumrit and Aranya are the director and the deputy director of the Division of Groundwater Resources. Tirasak and Nalpadal work for SNT, the environmental company. And the rest of the guys are DGR, Division of Groundwater Resources, government hydrogeologists. Okay, so the way it works is that they've decided to fund the project. A few of these guys manage from the government side. They provide the contract to SNT, the environmental company, who subcontracts to us, the American experts, as they call us. But you'll notice in this picture everyone's smiling. And we had it was a great team. One of my favorite things about working with the Thai is that they're always smiling, they're always laughing. And every night we go out for dinner, we never get done in an hour. We took hours and we talked about everything and laughed. Some of you guys will be in my field methods class in May, and a few of them, actually, Tirasak, Sikrat, and Wasan will be part of that team. They're coming over here for a week. We'll be hosting a meeting. So what's this artificial storage and recovery all about? What's ASR stand for? Basically, it's a real simple concept. You take water from the river, especially during flood stage when maybe it would cause problems in Bangkok, and pump it back down into the groundwater and store it for future use. So this system's not new. We've been doing this for 50 years. Why are we doing it? As the world's resources change, freshwater supplies become more limited. We know that there are densely populated urban areas, for example, like Beijing. It's using the water faster than it's being resupplied. Or places like the Ogallala, that's using it faster than it's being supplied, but maybe doesn't support a population of 30 million people. We know that wetlands and estuaries are maybe not as tolerant to some of the things we ask them to do. Runoff from storm sewers, for example, may not be treated so well. We may have stressed the wetlands and reached their limit. And we know that groundwater is being depleted worldwide. Solutions to that have been to consider things like desalinization of seawater, using brackish water, trying to treat it. Reclaiming other water. If you know about the reverse osmosis plant out in Hutchinson, for example, using wastewater and treating it and putting it into the waste stream. And maybe reusing some water that we've already used in a treatment system elsewhere. All of these are very expensive. Another solution would be to store water that occurs during heavy rainfall events or during flooding in either above ground or below ground systems. Okay, so this is the alternative that seems to be the most reasonable in terms of costs and logistics. How does it work? Basically, we install a groundwater well, large diameter, a large well, fairly deep, inject water into that well, and force it into the surrounding aquifer. So that water then moves into the permeable pore spaces of maybe a sand and gravel aquifer system. And as it does so, it doesn't move as a bubble, but it actually diffuses and spreads and mixes with the native groundwater. So it will probably move into the native groundwater a little bit rather than staying contained. Eventually that means that the water table is going to rise in the vicinity of the well, and then hopefully recharge the entire region if you continuously pump large distances. The advantage to doing this is that you can take water then during a flood season and store it for use during a drought season. Here's another scenario, same picture basically, the stored water, maybe the native water, and something that happens in between where they get mixed. We might call that a buffer zone. There's the one that's mixed in between, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Oops. Okay, so maybe ASR is the best solution. This is a slide that my colleague, the engineer, let me borrow. He had a problem where he, down in Florida, where he had to find storage for 600 million gallons of water. This is for a community in, I think, Tampa. And they compared the cost of putting storage tanks on the land surface. Usually storage tanks for water are about 120 to 125 million gallon tanks. The cost of installing those I guess there's 125 million gallon tanks, I think that's what he's trying to say. And the cost for doing that's over $100 million to install all of those tanks. Also, it would take lots of land to do that. You'd have to have a large parcel of land to put the tanks on. You could store the same volume of water in 6 artificial recharge wells. The cost $3 to $5 million, and it would take up a lot less of a land footprint to do. So Kevin's company, the engineer that you saw the picture of, specializes in ASR systems, so they've done a lot of cost comparative work like this. So I mentioned that these have been in place all over the country. These are places where ASR systems are already operational or are being developed. A lot of them down in the Florida area, where saline water encroaches on fresh water, and it's, in many cases, by injecting, they can force the saline encroachment back outward to keep the fresh water available for drinking. Places like San Antonio, coast of California, places where dry or arid conditions, overuse of water, major metropolitan areas. And one you might have noticed right here in Kansas. Turns out that the situation in Kansas, the ASR in Kansas is the largest one in the world right now. $227 million have been spent in Wichita to do artificial storage and recovery. So I've given this talk before, I think to geography, or maybe it was Environmental Institute one summer, over here in this building someplace, where I talked about the work my grad students have done in the Equus beds. Equus beds is the name of the aquifer. Here's the Arkansas River. I think, Susie, Halstead's over here somewhere, right? And it hasn't happened in a little while, but it used to flood. And during the flood stage, then the water could be drawn off the river and injected. It's actually treated first, and then it's injected in a groundwater well. And you can see the zone of influence right here. The original water table, 1940 water table, was this dark blue line. And after injection, the water table's up about 40% when this image was created. So by taking water out of the Ark River during flood stage and injecting it, Wichita appears to have a solution to their overpumping problem. The Equus beds has been depleted by about 60% of its original capacity since the 1940s, largely because Wichita has a well field up here near Halstead and Hutchison, and they draw their water from the aquifer and then pump it back down to Wichita. That's part of it. The other part of it is that there are, it's supposed to be crops, major irrigators out here. So the irrigators also draw from the Equus beds. So there's been a lot of stress on the aquifer. And the goal that the city of Wichita had was to resupply that aquifer, then storing that water for future development, population in Wichita. Okay, just a few things about Wichita. I probably have said some of this already. Here's the river we just looked at. These are injection wells that are connected by a pipeline. So the water's treated, and then it's moved along these and injected at different places along the way. And like I said, it's increased substantially since the 1940s. Same process. Okay, so when you do this, you might think, can you really do that? Can you take water from the river and put it into the ground and not have any kind of reactions? The answer is no, you can't. Really important aspect of this work is to match the water chemistries so that the river water and the groundwater are compatible. This is my part of the project. My interest is in understanding what happens when we take water out of the river and we pump it down into the well, down into the ground. So imagine this being a groundwater aquifer with sand and gravel and pieces of quartz and feldspar and mica for you guys who are geologists, and sitting there in the presence of water. Water at a certain pH, EH, conductivity, dissolved oxygen concentration. That water is in equilibrium with those minerals. It's been sitting there for maybe hundreds of thousands of years in Kansas, or even in the alluvium in Thailand, reacting with those minerals, exchanging chemicals, or I should say elements, between the water and the rock matrix. So it's in equilibrium. We come out and we inject water into it, we may disturb that equilibrium. For example, we might change the pH, EH, dissolved oxygen, conductivity conditions, such that some minerals precipitate out of the water, maybe clogging up the space in between the grains. Or some minerals may dissolve slightly, contributing a different chemistry to the water, possibly releasing things like arsenic or dangerous metals. Why do we perform a geochemical assessment? To understand exactly what might happen if we start recharging the aquifer with incompatible water. And as part of that assessment, not only do we look at the chemistry of the water, but we also look at the minerals. Are these minerals the type that will exchange metals or will exchange materials? Are they things that will dissolve or precipitate if we change the pH just a little bit, or if we inject oxygenated water, what's going to happen? So we need to know a few things. We need to know the groundwater chemistry. We need to know something about minerals and rocks and sediments themselves, and a little bit about the surface water that's going in, the recharge water. In our case, we're using river or surface water. What's this chemistry? Those are the elements of the work that I've done in Thailand. So this is an area where we're testing this ASR system in Thailand. It's called the Sukhothai site. I don't know if anybody, I was hoping there might be a student here that spoke Thai, but I don't know if we have any on campus. As you enter our field site, that's what you see, a sign explaining what's here. It's a pretty small site. It was established, as I mentioned, in 2010 by the DGR, and they actually tried this once and it didn't work. So their idea was to recharge the water, not through wells, but through some big irrigation ponds that would slowly leach the water into the groundwater. They're left behind. They're just there today. Sometimes we fill them up with discharge water. Sometimes they go dry. They really don't do anything exciting. These are a couple of the injection or the ASR wells. And this is our treatment system. We take the water from the river, the Chao River, or sorry, the Yam tributary, treat it, and then inject it back into the ground. To install those wells, we had to go out and do a couple of things. This is a, is anybody in field methods? You're in field methods. That's a reverse rotary. I guess it was in hydro yesterday we're talking about. It's a reverse rotary drilling rig. So it's drilling into the ground and bringing samples up to the surface for logging. Once the borehole is drilled, this is the well casing that goes in. You see it's a slotted casing. So the screen, or the permeable part of the well that's going to allow the water to move through it, is put at the bottom, and then there's solid riser pipe that comes up to the surface. It's very simple. Before those wells are installed, we need to know where to put that slotted screen. In other words, where the recharge will occur in the aquifer. So geophysical surveys were run. And here's a fellow who's got a cable that runs down the well. As it goes down the well, it records something like the electrical conductance of the materials. So we might know if there's electrically conductive clays and non-conductive sands as we go. It might also record the radioactivity of the materials. Folks don't realize oftentimes that clays are slightly radioactive. It can create a radioactive signal that we can back them down. It's the combination of those geophysical logs that allows us to figure out where to put that screen, where the well will be most productive. In the process of drilling those wells, we obtained cores of sediment, which then I could have analyzed for mineralogy and the sediment type to know what the sediments or the aquifer material is made of. This is the engineering approach to identifying the grain size. The bigger the grains, generally, the more pore space and higher yielding the aquifer would be. In other words, the more water we can store there. Okay, and then we might want to know exactly what these things are made out of. Do what's called a scanning electron microscope photo, where we get down to a millionth of a millimeter and look at the grains up close to try to identify what the mineral types are. Another analysis called XRD looks at the thickness between the layers of atoms in the grains and helps identify those minerals. So these samples then are split up and sent to a lab for this sort of analysis. So here's a typical injection well at our site. You'll notice there's a pipe going in and a pipe going out. It's very simple. And it's completed in the porous aquifer, and there's a clay layer between us and the porous aquifer system. These are some students, actually, this is the site manager and his helpers. At that injection well, our treated water comes in here, forced down into the aquifer, and then if we want to remove it, we pump it out this way, and it goes across the road into the river. So I'm going to show you a map of our site. The photos I've been showing you are this region. Those are the two leftover pits, the leftover lagoons that aren't being used. Right across the road is the Yam River, so very close to our recharge source. This water gets pumped over here. It's treated, so it chemically matches the groundwater. And then these are our two injection wells where we force it back down into the aquifer. There's another view of our field site. The river on the bottom, the Chao, the Yam River. Okay, so the two irrigation or injection wells are over here. And if we want to know whether or not they're actually functioning, we might want to have another window or another look into the aquifer. To do that, we've installed, you can kind of see them here, what are called monitoring wells. So we have these big injection wells that can pump 40 million gallons per day into the ground. Then we want to know if that groundwater is moving and how compatible it is with the aquifer. So we'll put in small little monitoring wells that'll allow us just to take some samples and see what's going on below the surface. Here's a team measuring the water levels in those monitoring wells. As we inject, does the water level rise in the aquifer? We can check that by looking at some of the monitoring wells that are very close to the injection, and some of them that are pretty far away. These guys are standing in front of a very mature sugarcane field. Some of my photos, you'll see a lot of smoke in the background. While we were there, it was harvest season. So we were surrounded by sugarcane on one side, and the sugarcane here is bounded by papaya, mango, coconut, banana. And so we never got hungry at this field site. We were able to just run across the street and pull something out of the wells. But out of the trees. You'll notice they're enclosed in fences, largely to keep the coconuts from falling into the wells, and also kind of to protect them from vandals. There's never been a vandal in the area, but since they're government funded, we decided not spare any expenses, and we've protected them. I said it's non-technical, right? So I'm not going to get too technical with you, but some of the results that came back then from the continuous coring that you saw in slides, the pictures of, looking at the grain size with depth. If you just look at the yellow, you'll notice that within that 40 meters or so of aquifer, the distribution of the gravel is higher in some cases and lower in other places. That's important as we try to understand the movement of the water and how it might react with the sediments. The mineralogy analysis, I know you can't read this, but I'll tell you that we observe quartz, illite, clay mineral, orthoclase, another type of silicate mineral, another clay, kaolinite, goethite and hematite are iron oxides, calcite, siderite, chlorite, montmorillonite, and dolomite. So the geologists in here might know what some of those are. Complete mineralogic analysis of our sediments, done with XRD analysis. My job was to understand the compatibility of those materials. So I looked at the chemical concentrations of major ions like chloride, calcium, sulfate, magnesium in the water, and I observed immediately that there were two groups. river, shallow and deep aquifer samples. That's plotted in different locations. River water looks even different from that. And when I mix those two and predict whether or not the equilibrium will be established in the aquifer, I can see that as I mix, there's pure aquifer groundwater and pure river water. And as you mix river water with the aquifer, the solubility of those different minerals changes. So in other words, we might have calcite in the ground now, and it's stable. But as we add more river water, maybe that calcite has a tendency to dissolve or precipitate. So again, without going into a lot of detail, this is called a saturation index plot, and it tells you whether or not you would expect things to dissolve or precipitate. Each mineral then was modeled using the chemistry of the water and mineralogy observed in the pore. Okay, so this is just one example then of what happens at our field site when we inject that water. You might remember this map. I said there were a couple of recharge wells or injection wells, and they were surrounded by monitoring wells, the wells that provide the window into the aquifer. Let us know what's going on in the subsurface. So as we pump into one of these, we can take samples then from these guys and determine if the water's moving. One of the best ways to do that is to use what's called a tracer. And in our case, we're going to use chloride. The treated water is chlorinated water. So when we put chloride in, or we put treated water into our injection well, it's got a lot of chloride in it. This is the background condition before we inject. And the chloride concentrations never get over about, it's not right, never get over about 10. So really low chloride in the groundwater. But after injection, we see, then the scale's correct, values up around 40 milligrams per liter. So background conditions, watch what happens right around well number 2. High chloride concentrations, and the chloride appears to slowly moving away from that well as we observe lower concentrations, but they're still increasing in our nearby observation wells. Okay, so again, I'm not going to get very technical with this, but there are pretty sophisticated ways then to just track the chloride concentration in one of these wells and figure out how long it's going to take for that water to get here. It takes that long to get here, how long is it going to take to get to the rest of the aquifer system on a large scale? One of my counterparts is a guy named Dr. Young at Konkan University. He's the groundwater modeler. He'll take this information then, and he'll predict on the large scale, if this system works, how long will it take to bring the water table back on a regional scale in the Chao Phraya River Basin aquifer system. This is the sort of information we need to do that. Okay, so I'm just about done. This is the end of the first year of the project. And at the end of the first year, what we've recognized is that there are 2 different background chemistries, so shallow and deep water chemistries. We basically characterized the system very well. We've identified a water treatment system that will match the river water to the groundwater and allow the water to move successfully without clogging up the aquifer or dissolving parts of it. We conducted 4 what we call injection cycles. In other words, we injected the water and then we recovered it to see if we could take out what we put in. Identified some things that we needed to change, like pumping rates, and a little bit of the pH of the water needed to be adjusted slightly. We also characterized the background mineralogy and chemistry, and we determined the rates and volumes of pumping each year. Year 2, recommendations. In fact, on the 25th, the Thai team will present the results of year 1. So they'll compile all the information we've all collected, and they'll make recommendations for next year. And those recommendations on my part will include things like doing continuous monitoring of the river. What I've observed is that the river chemistry changes through time during the wet and dry season, so that we can't really count on one water chemistry in the river. We've got to adjust our injection methods to account for the differences in water chemistry in the river. We've also got to focus a little bit more on making the treatment water more constant. The treated water varies in pH from something like 8.2 to 8.7, which changes the equilibrium when the 2 waters are mixed. And we're going to try running 4 new cycles, 4 more practice runs, if you will, at lower flow rates. See if we can get the water to go in at a little more constant rate. The engineers have worked on that side of the project. So we're just starting year 2. I've got lots more I can tell you guys about. And hopefully I'll be involved in the second year of the project. I thought I should end with one cultural slide for you. That's the Reclining Buddha in Wat Po, a temple. He's about 2,000 years old. And I don't know if I like this picture because there are no people in it, but then there's no scale, right? So I think he's about 100 feet long. It's pretty large. One of the largest Buddhas, and rare to see a reclining Buddha in Thailand. So I did it. You've got 10 minutes to ask any questions you got. Thank you.